The New Deal. In 1933, FDR becomes the president. Immediately, he is going to move to reassure the American people. He has some famous quotes right off the bat, things like, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And then he goes on to promise the American people action, and action now. The first 3 months of FDR's administration are going to be dubbed famously as the 100 days of the New Deal. We're going to see that a democratically controlled Congress is going to pass a lot of important laws during this time period that collectively come to be known as the New Deal. Now, where these ideas come from was a mix of FDR himself as well as others, such as advisors. Some of them are a mix that you can see are principles from like the progressive era movement, and some of them were actually even plans that Hoover had wanted to implement, or at least Hoover's administration had wanted to implement. So the first issue that he has to deal with is the banking crisis. There's just been all the runs on the banks and all that issue. And so Congress is going to pass the Emergency Banking Act. This was a conservative measure that basically extended government assistance to sound banks and helped reorganize weak ones. So if a bank was still going and it was making smart investments that made sense, the government's reaching out and helping it and basically reorganizing the ones that have some issues. So we have this prompt government action, but a lot of the economy is about people's perception of the economy. And so there's an element here of that FDR needs to reassure the American people that they can trust the banks, especially now with government action getting involved. And so he's going to do this through his very, very important fireside chats. Basically, over the radio, the president would directly talk to the American people. And in this way, he restores popular confidence in the banks. And we're going to see this, that he restores a lot of confidence in the economy overall over time. And it's an element of bringing hope to the American people, that the president's directly speaking to them in their own home. We're also going to see in June of that year, Congress is going to create the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is the FDIC. This is going to guarantee bank deposits up to $2,500. That's a big deal. So no matter what, you're guaranteed that money if you put it in the bank and everything. We're also going to see that he's going to have the financial industry reformed too, very quickly. We're going to get things like the Glass-Steagall Act that separates investment banking from commercial banking. Basically, this is going to curtail a lot of that risky speculation with like individuals' money. We also get things like the Securities Act. This is reforming the sale of stocks, and so it's going to prevent all of that insider abuses when dealing with the stock market. Try to kind of break away from some of the speculators and manipulators of the stock market. We're also going to get the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is the SEC. This is specifically created to regulate the stock market. So I want you to think about these themes that come out here, because obviously I don't have every single one of these acts written down. So what kinds of themes are coming through with his financial industry being reformed, kind of thing? The next issue is creating jobs, giving relief for the unemployed. So we're going to see the creation of, and I'm going to just tell you this right now, there's a bunch of acronyms here. Don't stress too much if you don't know what every single one of them stands for. They are in your books, I promise you that. It's more about, once again, what are the themes that you see being pushed forward here. So we got FERA, the FERA. This is the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. We're going to see this furnishes a lot of funds to basically state and local agencies. We're going to see the Civil Works Administration, the CWA. This is going to combine work relief with preserving the skills and basically morale of the recipients. It's going to create jobs for about 4 million men and women, Mostly these are going to be hiring laborers to like build roads and airports, or hire teachers to staff rural schools, singers and artists to give, public performances. Then we get the Public Works Administration, the PWA. This is going to provide work relief on useful projects that would help stimulate the economy. So it's through public expenditures like building schools, because that's going to help stimulate the economy, because if people have a better education, they can get better jobs, they can get better paid, they can buy more stuff, etc., etc., etc. But also like public expenditures like building hospitals, courthouses, dams, bridges. And then we get the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, which basically combined work relief with conservation. A big thing that they do is like work on reforestation. They also work on like flood control projects. They'd build roads and bridges and national forests and parks. If you go drive through like a national park or forest, there's a pretty good chance that road was initially built during the Great Depression by the like CCC. They would restore Civil War battlefields. They would fight forest fires. And the thing is, the CCC was paid $30 a month, but 25 of those dollars had to be sent home to their family. And so that's a big deal, because it's being sent home to their family. Who is going to spend that money? You can't just hoard the money and save and save and save and save. You're spending the money because that's going to help boost the economy in the long run. Then we have the whole big issue with farming. And so to help farmers, the New Deal is going to promote economic recovery there by establishing the AAA. This is the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. This is trying to combat the depression in agriculture, because that depression was caused by like crop surpluses, meaning low prices. And so basically the government through the AAA is going to subsidize farmers who agreed to restrict production. So don't grow as much corn, because then less corn on the market means that the price of corn will raise, and that will actually bring the farm prices back to parity level. And so this in this way will help restore farmers' purchasing power over time. So they would do things like in 1933, they paid Southern farmers to plow up 10 million acres of cotton, and farmers to bury about 9 million pounds of pork. On one hand, this is going to bring up the price of these items, and agricultural conditions are going to improve. But you also have to imagine this is going to be met with public outrage, because this brings up prices, and a lot of people don't have money to pay for those new prices when it comes to food. And on top of that, people are like starving during this time, and yet they're burying pork across the countryside. The other thing that is going to decrease production, and we're going to get more into it later, and thus increase prices, is going to be all the droughts and the dust storms on the Great Plains, the Dust Bowl basically. Overall as well, the AAA ends up harming poor farmers while really aiding large commercial growers, because the thing is, you have a planter that owns a lot of acreage. Well, they're going to restrict what acreage is being used. And so that means they're going to dismiss some of the tenant farmers on their land or the sharecroppers on their land, and also in the meantime might buy like new farm machinery. Thus it reduced the need for farm labor, and so it really hurts a lot of those farm laborers. The Supreme Court is eventually going to declare the AAA unconstitutional in 1936, but still the new laws are going to establish basically a farm subsidiary program that is going to continue on for decades to come. It's also just meaning that a lot of farmers can mechanize during this time period, and scientific agriculture is going to keep production high, and farmers are basically going to continue to be dependent on the government. The other thing is helping out or handling industry. We're going to see the establishment of the NIRA, which is the National Industrial Recovery Act. The National Industrial Recovery Act is then going to create the NRA, which is the National Recovery Administration. Please make note that is not the same NRA that people talk about in politics today. National Recovery Administration. So basically they wanted to do things like halt the slide in prices, halt the slide in wages, halt unemployment and things like that by suspending antitrust laws and authorizing industrial and like trade associations to draft codes and set production quotas and price policies and wages and working conditions and such. Just in general business practices. It was very much about promoting the interest of business generally, and really they wanted to promote the interests of big businesses more than anything else, but they were also simultaneously supposed to guarantee workers the right to like organize unions and bargain collectively. So you get the NRA Blue Eagle insignia that you can see pictured here, covering workplaces, storefronts, billboards, because it's supposed to be helping the laborers as much as it helps the businesses. However, support for the NRA is going to wane. Basically, corporate leaders used it to advance their own goals and discriminate against smaller producers and smaller consumers and labor and such. Also, businesses, quite frankly, they violated a lot of labor rights even when they were posting the NRA Blue Eagle. Basically, businesses saw like collective bargaining as infringing on their authority. And so basically the NRA does very little to enforce that businesses should allow their laborers to collectively bargain. And in fact, the NRA is basically going to denounce all strikes. Workers, fairly so, felt betrayed. And this act, just like the AAA, is actually going to be declared unconstitutional in 1935. As the last part of this video, I did want to talk about my own personal family relations who were alive during the Great Depression, because I do find that having that personal connection to the Great Depression makes it a lot more real. I would also really encourage you to go home, ask your parents, ask your grandparents. It might be ask your grandparents about their parents' kind of experience during this time period. My mom is the youngest of 6 kids, and so my grandparents, they died when I was 6, but as you can see here, they were both very much alive during the Great Depression, so I'm a lot closer connected to the Great Depression than a lot of people, so I wouldn't be surprised if you're asking about great-grandparents or even great-great-grandparents, depending. So just giving you some personal stories. My grandfather, Richard Winters, he was born in 1919, but the thing is, he was probably one of those lucky few people that escaped a lot of hardships during the Great Depression. And I know how extremely lucky and how unlikely that was. The thing is, my grandfather's father, so my great-grandfather, had a bunch of investments in the stock market, but right before the stock market crashed, he actually cashed out all of his investments and bought a house. And the thing is, as long as he paid off the house, he didn't have to worry about it being taken away and thus being homeless. Whereas someone else who might have put even more money in the stock market, when it crashed, they lost all of that money and that investment. So it was more luck on timing than anything else that allowed him to escape some hard times. The other thing is, most jobs suffered during this time. However, one job that it was actually needed even more: accountants. The thing is, after the stock market crash, basically all of the companies had to get third parties to verify their books. And so as an accountant, he had plenty of work to do. And so this was the part of society that he lived in that they were pretty well off, they were members of the country club, things like that. And I recognize that that success probably led to thus, my grandfather being successful. My grandfather didn't complete college, but he still went to college for a time period before World War II, which is a big deal because that's a lot different during that time period. And then that led to, my parents' success, which leads to my success, because there is an element of the economically, they didn't have to worry as much about that helping me out in the long run. My grandmother, though, is a much more stereotypical story for someone who's growing up during the Great Depression. The thing is, she was a kid at the time, and her father, my great-grandfather, worked for the newspaper company in town. Basically, it was one of those things that the newspaper, rather than letting anyone go and laying anyone off, they basically just kept cutting everyone's pay. And so as the Great Depression went on, her family got poorer and poorer and poorer. For instance, when her first husband deployed during World War II, she's actually going to stay living at home with her parents to help ends meet and everything. Before getting married, though, she used to talk about how she would go pick up her dad's paycheck before he got off work on Fridays, because the whole thing was, if they waited for their father to get off work, it would be too late to pick up the paycheck on Friday. And if they didn't get the paycheck on Friday, they didn't have enough money for food to eat that night. And so my grandmother's like big goal in life during her late teens and early 20s, her goal was basically to be able to wait until Monday to have to cash a check. So her goal wasn't about like a certain job or anything like that, or dream. Think about like what your dreams or aspirations were or are in high school and early college to this. That she just wanted to be able to wait a whole weekend before having to pay her check. And keep in mind, there are people that still have that kind of aspiration in life today, unfortunately. But she also was really lucky in that her father didn't lose his job. And on top of that, because he worked for a newspaper, he had to go cover events at different times. And sometimes they would allow him to take like one of his children with him to like cover a story, like a baseball game or something. And so she did actually get to attend some really random events during her childhood that a lot of people really wouldn't have been able to. And so I want you to think about this, and please go ask your family about, like, is there any family stories that you can talk about during the Great Depression?